Chapter 1. The Land Before the City. There is no rush here. Nothing in the hours ahead will ask anything of you. There is no test at the end of this story. No need to hold every name. No need even to stay awake. If sleep comes, let it come. The story will keep. We are going back a very long way, before the emperors, before the legions, before the forum, before the first stone was set upon another stone, back to a green country under an old sun, where a river moves quietly toward the sea. Settle in, let the day go, and let Rome begin. Before there was Rome, there was the land. Picture a long peninsula, shaped a little like a boot, reaching down from the cold shadow of the Alps into the warm middle of a great sea. A spine of mountains runs its whole length, gray limestone ridges folded one behind another, holding snow into late spring. On either side of that spine, the land steps down toward water, toward one sea in the east, and toward another, wider and softer, in the west. It is on the western side that our story lives. Here the mountains loosen their grip. The ridges open into hill country, and the hill country settles into plains, and the plains run down at last to a low, hazy coast of dunes and salt marsh. The light on this side of the peninsula is famous even now, long, honeyed, forgiving, and it was the same light then, falling on a country that did not yet know what it would carry. This western land had been made, in great part, by fire. Long before any human footprint, volcanoes had risen here, burned and gone quiet, leaving behind broad shoulders of dark rock and, more importantly, their gift, soil. Volcanic soil, deep and rich, the kind that repays a farmer twice over. Where that soil lay, forests grew thick, oak and beech on the heights, willow and poplar in the wet ground below, and in time, wherever the trees were cleared, grain grew, and vines, and olives. South of where our city will one day stand, one of those old volcanoes remains as a ring of green mountains, cupping a lake in its ancient crater. Around it spreads a plain of that same dark, generous earth. The people who would come to live on this plain called themselves Latins, and the plain itself Latium, and from that small name, in the fullness of time, would come the word for the language in which half of Europe would one day pray, argue, and write its laws. But that is far ahead of us. For now there is only the plain, the hills, the seasons, and there is the river. It rises far to the north, in the high Apennines, as a cold thread among beech trees. It gathers streams the way a story gathers tellers, and by the time it reaches the country of the Latins, it is a broad, strong, winding river, some hundreds of feet across, the color of clay, a pale, muddy gold. Later poets would call it blonde. It flooded in winter and spring, spreading brown water over its lowlands, and shrank in high summer to run slow and thoughtful between banks of reeds. The Latins came to call it the Tiber. Hold on to that river. Of everything in this entire story, every wall, every crown, every law, the Tiber is the oldest, and it will be there at the very end, still moving. Empires are temporary. Rivers are patient. Now, about 15 miles upstream from the sea, this river does something small that will matter enormously. It bends and slows and splits for a moment around a little island. And there, at the island, the water runs shallow enough that a person, or a mule, or a herd can cross. A ford. That is all. A place to walk across a river without drowning. But look at what meets there. Down from the mountains, following the river valley, comes the track of the shepherds, who walk their flocks between summer pastures in the heights and winter pastures on the plain, as their people have done beyond all memory. And along the river from the coast comes another track, worn by the feet of those carrying the one treasure the salt marshes at the river's mouth produce in abundance: salt itself, the preserver of meat and cheese, the thing every inland village needs and cannot make. Where the salt track crosses the shepherd's track, at the one good ford on the lower river, paths from 4 directions are braided into one crossing. We should pause on those tracks for a moment, because one of them is an ancestor. It is nothing yet, a ribbon of trodden earth, dust in August, mud in November, wandering around boulders and fallen trees. But a track that people cannot afford to stop using is a road waiting to be born. Remember this dusty lane. We will watch what becomes of it, and by the end of this story, its descendants will run from the moors of Britain to the edge of the Sahara. For Rome, they begin here, in the mud by the ford. And beside the crossing, on the eastern bank, the land rises into a cluster of hills. There are 7 of them, more or less, and they are not grand. A person in good health can walk up any of them in a few minutes. They are steep-sided lumps of soft volcanic stone, flat-topped, separated from one another by narrow valleys where streams trickle down toward the river and the ground lies marshy and rank. In summer, the low ground hums with mosquitoes. In winter, it floods. But the hilltops are another matter. They stand above the fevers and the floods. They catch the breeze. They can be defended by a child with a pile of stones. And from their crowns, you can see everything that matters: the ford, the river, the tracks, the plain, and far off on clear days, the ring of green mountains to the south, and the sea shining flat in the west. People noticed. Of course they noticed. By roughly 3,000 years ago, there were villages on these hills. Nothing that would catch a traveler's breath. Clusters of round huts with walls of woven branches plastered in clay, roofs of thatch, a smoke hole at the peak. A few dozen families to a hilltop, pens for sheep and goats, small fields in the cleared ground. The dead laid in the marshy valley between the hills, some of their ashes placed in little clay urns shaped, touchingly, like the huts they had lived in. Small houses for the dead, made by people who could imagine no better home than home. We know these villages were real. Their post holes are still there, cut into the rock of the hills, under the palaces that came later. Archaeologists have knelt and measured them. That is worth saying plainly. Here at the start, some of what fills this story is legend, and we will always tell you which is which. But the huts were real. The story begins with the truth of small houses. Let us spend a day there. We may picture a boy on the largest of the hills. Call it a morning in late spring, roughly 3,000 years ago. He wakes in the dark, in the warm fug of the hut under a sheepskin, to the sound of his mother raking the hearth embers alive. The fire in the center of the floor is the heart of the house, and it is never allowed to wholly die. Keeping it is the first responsibility he was ever given, and in the way of his people, the hearth is not only warmth but presence, something honored, something owed. He eats what there is: hard cheese, flat bread baked on a stone, water. Then he takes his stick, whistles the dog, and lets the sheep out of the fold into the gray before dawn. He walks them down the flank of the hill, through wet grass to their pasture above the marsh. The valley below him, the low, soggy ground between his hill and the next, where the dead sleep and the herons stalk, steams gently as the sun comes up. Frogs fall silent as he passes and resume behind him. Across that little valley, he can see smoke beginning to rise from the huts of the neighboring hill. Another village, people much like his own, sometimes rivals, sometimes kin, their girls married across, their quarrels patched at festivals. The day is long and unhurried in the way of all days spent watching animals eat. He moves the flock with a word. He eats his bread at noon in the shade of an oak. He watches the river below, running gold in the light, and watches the ford, because the ford is where anything new always comes from. Today, men driving mules loaded with salt up from the coast, pausing mid-river to let the animals drink, calling to each other in a dialect close enough to his own to understand. Toward evening, he watches his grandfather do a thing his people always do. The old man stands still, facing the sky over the mountains, and watches the birds go home. How many, from which quarter, in what manner they fly. His people hold that the world is always speaking, that the flight of birds, the shiver of leaves on a still day, the behavior of the sacred fire, all of it carries meaning for those with the patience to read it. Nothing important, a marriage, a journey, the breaking of new ground, is begun without asking first, in this way, whether the day is willing. The boy waits. The old man watches the sky the way we might watch a face. At last he nods, satisfied, and turns for home, and the boy brings the sheep up the hill behind him into the fold, and the stars come out over Latium, and that is all. That is the whole day. It was never written down. Days like it happened, in their thousands, on these hills, and the world took no notice at all. That is the ground floor of this entire story. Before Rome is marble, before it is law, before it is an empire of 50 million souls, it is this: sheep on a hill above a ford, smoke rising from thatch, an old man reading the evening sky. Beyond the hills, the wider world was already old and busy. North across the river, and the river was the border, the line between the familiar and the foreign, lay the country of the Etruscans. They were the sophisticates of the peninsula, a people of true cities, set on hilltops behind real walls, rich from iron and copper mines, famous for their bronze work, their painted tombs, their banquets, and their music. Their traders' goods reached the Latin villages and were wondered at, and they were famous for something else, which the Latins watched closely. They were held, far and wide, to be masters at reading the will of the gods, in the flight of birds, in lightning, in the inner organs of sacrificed animals. Much of what Rome would one day believe about speaking with heaven, it would learn or borrow or inherit from the north bank of the Tiber. And far to the south, along the coasts, there were newcomers from over the sea, Greeks. They had come in ships, generation after generation, planting colony towns on the best harbors of southern Italy and Sicily, towns with temples of stone and painted pottery and an alphabet, that clever, portable trick of catching speech in marks. The alphabet traveled north from hand to hand, traders to Etruscans, Etruscans to Latins, changing shape a little at every step. The letters this story will one day be written in were at this moment, working their way up the peninsula like a slow rumor. So set the scene one last time and hold it. A green plain under a ring of old volcanoes, a gold-brown river flooding and shrinking with the year, 7 small hills at a ford, wearing villages of thatch, shepherds' tracks and salt tracks braided together at the crossing. To the north, across the water, a rich and learned people who read the sky. To the south, sea people with stone temples and letters. And in between, on the hills, a cluster of farmer-shepherd villages that no one in the wider world had any reason to notice. Nothing here is destined. No god has marked this ford on a map, though the people who lived there would come much later, to believe with all their hearts that one had. What the place has is simpler. Good soil, a defensible height, fresh water, salt, and a crossing everyone needs. Geography is not fate, but it is a standing invitation. In time, the villages on those hilltops would begin to lean together, to bury their dead in shared ground, to drain the wet valley between them, to become, slowly and without ceremony, one thing instead of several. And much, much later, when that one thing had grown so great that it frightened even itself, its people would look back at these hills and this river and ask the question every people eventually asks: how did we begin? The true answer, huts, sheep, salt, a ford, did not satisfy them. Beginnings so humble rarely do. So they reached instead for a story of a king's stolen daughters, of twin boys set adrift on this same river, of a she-wolf in the dark of a cave. That story is where we go next. Chapter 2. The Wolf and the King. Every people keeps two versions of its own beginning, the one that happened and the one they tell. We have seen the first, the hills, the huts, the ford. Now before we go further, we should hear the second, the way the Romans themselves told it. Because for 1,000 years and more, this was the truest thing they knew about themselves. We will tell it as what it is, a legend, and we will say so as we go. But listen to it the way they did, at the fire, at bedtime, in the schoolroom. Because a people's chosen story tells you what they wished to be. It begins, they said, with a wrong. In one of the old towns of the Latin plain, so the story goes, a king was overthrown by his brother. To make sure the fallen king's line would die with him, the usurper forced the king's daughter to become a priestess, one of the virgins who tend a sacred flame and may never marry. Her name, in the legend, was Rhea Silvia, but the story says the god of war himself came to her, and she bore twin sons. The usurper, frightened of the boys, ordered them drowned. His servants carried the infants down to the Tiber, our Tiber, the same gold-brown water, and, unwilling or unable to wade into the winter flood, set them adrift in a basket at the edge and left them to the river. The river, the Romans like to say, refused the crime. The flood withdrew, and the basket came to rest in the mud at the foot of a hill, the very hill, they said, where our shepherd boy watched his sheep, beneath a fig tree, at the mouth of a cave. And out of the dark of that cave came a she-wolf. She did not kill them. In the story, she lowered herself in the shadows and let the two human infants nurse alongside her own kind, and licked them clean, until a shepherd found the children and carried them home to his wife, and the twins grew up as shepherd sons on the hill above the ford, not knowing they were the grandsons of a king. Their names were Romulus and Remus. You can guess much of the rest, because it is shaped like all such stories. The twins grew strong, discovered who they were, avenged their grandfather, and then, restless, as founders must be, came back to the hills where the wolf had saved them, to build a city of their own. And there the story darkens, and the Romans never pretended otherwise. The brothers quarreled over which hill to build on, over whose name the city would carry, over the meaning of the birds they watched for a sign. Romulus began marking out his boundary, plowing a furrow around the hill to trace where his wall would stand, a line he declared sacred. And Remus, mocking his brother's little wall, jumped over it. Romulus killed him, his own twin, at the foundation. The first blood in Roman soil, the Romans admitted in their own founding story, was a brother's, shed over a wall and a name. It is a hard beginning to choose for yourself, and later Romans, in their civil wars, would remember it with a shudder, as if it had been a prophecy. But choose it they did. The city took Romulus's name, Rome, and they gave the founding a date. Roman scholars, counting back much later, fixed it precisely, and their traditional date has come down to us, 753 before the birth of Christ, roughly 28 centuries ago now, counting back from tonight. It is the first date we have spoken aloud in this story, and there will not be many. Hold it loosely. It is a date for a legend, remembered rather than recorded. But it is where Rome, all her long life, hung the beginning of her own calendar, counting her years from the founding of the city. So much for the story. Now set beside it, gently, what the ground itself says. The ground says, there was no single morning of founding. The ground says the villages on the hills grew for generations, then leaned together, that at some point the huts spread, the shared burying ground in the valley went out of use, and someone leveled and drained that low, marshy valley between the hills and made it a common ground, a meeting place. The ground even says that around the same era as the legend's date, give or take, someone built a real wall on the slope of that first hill. The post holes of the huts are there. The wall traces are there. A wolf cannot be excavated. A wall can. And the honest summary is this. The legend is not a record, but it is wrapped around something real. A real time when scattered villages became a single town with a boundary and a name. The Romans told it as a morning with a plow. The earth tells it as a long, slow braiding. Both agree that here at the ford, roughly 28 centuries ago, something began. There was a second legend too, which we will meet again much later, that long before the twins, a prince named Aeneas had escaped the burning of Troy and sailed west to Italy, carrying his father on his back and his gods in his arms, so that Rome's root was older than Rome. For now, simply know the Romans kept both stories and braided them because one beginning was never enough for them. The town that emerged from all this was ruled, in these early centuries, by kings. The Romans counted 7 of them, across nearly 2.5 centuries, and we will let almost all of them go by as the tradition remembers them. One warlike, one pious, one a builder, one who counted and organized the people. Reigns dissolving into a phrase. The way this story will often let rulers dissolve, so that the city itself can stay in view. Because it is the city, under the kings, that changes before our eyes. This is the era when Rome stops being a cluster of villages and starts being a place. Much of the visible change, tradition says, came under kings of Etruscan stamp, that rich, learned people from over the river, whose engineers, priests, and craftsmen left deep fingerprints on the young town. The wet valley between the hills was properly drained at last, its stream channeled into a great stone drain that ran down to the Tiber. A drain built so well, it should be said plainly, that parts of it still function beneath the city tonight. 20-some centuries on. The valley floor, dried and leveled and beaten flat, became the town's one shared open ground. Market, meeting place, court, and stage all at once. The Romans came to call it the Forum. Mark that word. We have now planted something that will grow through every hour of this series. The Forum, at this point, is nothing but a drained field with mud in winter. But it is the town's speaking place, and Rome would become one of the great civilizations of the speaking place. A people who believed that power must argue for itself out loud, in the open, in front of everybody. Wars will be declared in this field, and laws read out, and the dead praised, and the future fought over, sentence by sentence, for 1,000 years. When this series returns, again and again, to what we will call the Forum's voice, this is where that voice first clears its throat, in a drained marsh at the foot of the hills. Above the Forum, on the steepest of the 7 hills, the kings raised something else new, a great temple in the Etruscan manner, on a high stone platform, painted and bright, to the sky father the Latins called Jupiter. The grandest thing the town had ever built, visible from far out on the plain, announcing to every trader and shepherd who crossed the ford that this place now intended to be somebody. And it is under the kings that we first see clearly the thing that will sit at the center of Roman life for the whole first arc of this story. The Roman way of dealing with heaven. Understand it as the Romans understood it. In their belief, the world was crowded with divine powers, of sky and river, hearth and boundary, sowing and war. And these powers were not sentimental. They were more like great neighbors or great magistrates, beings with whom the community had a standing relationship that must be kept in good repair. The Romans even had a phrase for that state of good repair, the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. Keep the peace their tradition held, and the crops come, the floods spare you, the enemy stumbles. Break it, neglect a rite, botch a sacrifice, ignore a warning, and misfortune follows as surely as a debt falls due. So religion in Rome was less a matter of what you felt than of what you did, and did correctly. There were priests to keep the calendar of sacred days, and to know the right words spoken in the right order. For in Roman belief, a prayer with a slip of the tongue was void, like a contract misread aloud, and had to be begun again. There was a college of augurs, whose task was what that grandfather on the hill was doing generations before, reading the will of the sky in the flight of birds, a practice the Romans traced to Romulus himself, and one they credited the Etruscans with raising to a science. And in the heart of town there burned a fire that was never to go out. The hearth of the city itself, tended by a small college of priestesses sworn to the task. The flame of Vesta, the city's own version of the ember that boy's mother raked alive each morning. In Roman belief, as long as that fire burned, Rome stood. It would burn, tended in unbroken shifts, for over 1,000 years. And when, near the end of our story, it finally goes dark, you will feel what that meant. None of this, the record suggests, was cynical. It was the weather of their minds. And no public thing, no assembly, no election, no war, could rightly begin until the sky had been asked. We may imagine how that asking looked on some gray morning early in the city's life. An augur climbs the hill above the Forum in the last dark before dawn, wrapped against the cold, carrying a staff with a curved head, like a question mark. At the summit he stops, faces southeast toward the coming light, and with the staff he draws the sky, marking out in the air a great quiet rectangle of heaven, and speaking under his breath the old words that name its boundaries. Within that frame, and only within it, the signs will count. Then he sits and covers his head and waits. The town wakes below him. Smoke, cock-crow, the creak of the first carts down at the ford, and he does not move. He is listening to the sky. An hour passes. Then, from the left, the favorable quarter in the Roman reading, a flight of birds crosses the frame he has drawn, high and steady, and his lips move as he takes their number and their manner as a judge takes testimony. He rises. He uncovers his head. To the men waiting at the foot of the hill, he gives a single word. The gods do not object. The assembly may meet. The muster may proceed. The day is willing. In the belief of everyone on that hillside, the city has just spoken with heaven, and heaven has answered. Hold that image of watched birds. Centuries from now, Rome's legions will march under a standard raised on a pole. A bird, wings back, talons set, the eagle. When we meet it, remember where the Roman habit of looking up for meaning began. The eagle on the standard is, among other things, an augury that never lands. One more story from the age of kings must be told, because the Romans never stopped telling it, and because it shows how clear-eyed they could be about their own myths. The young city, the legend says, was a town of men, founders, herdsmen, fugitives, and it lacked wives, and its neighbors, distrusting the upstart place, refused their daughters. So Romulus proclaimed a festival, invited the neighboring Sabine people, and at a signal, the Romans seized the visiting women and carried them off to be their wives. Let us say it plainly, as the Romans' own poets sometimes did. The story describes a mass abduction, and no telling of it should sand that away. The legend continues that when the Sabine men came in arms to take their daughters back, the women themselves, now wives and mothers in Rome, walked out between the two armies and stopped the battle with their bodies and their voices, choosing, in the story, to bind the two peoples, rather than see either destroyed. And so Romans and Sabines became one city under two traditions. Why keep such a story? Because it said something Rome believed about itself, that it was, from the very beginning, a mixed people, refugees, neighbors, former enemies folded in. Rome's door, whatever else it was open inward. That openness, extended in time, even to the conquered, will prove one of the deep engines of everything that follows. And notice, too, who stands at the story's turning point. Women walking into the space between armies. It will not be the last time in this series that the story turns on that image. So the little town grew, walled, drained, templed, mixed, for nearly 2.5 centuries under its kings. And then the kings fell. The last of them, the tradition names Tarquin the Proud, and remembers as a tyrant out of a pattern book. Power seized by murder, the Senate of elders ignored, the people worn down with forced labor on the great works. The breaking point, in the story, was not politics at all, but a crime in the night. An assault by the king's son upon a married noblewoman, Lucretia, who summoned her kinsmen, told them plainly what had been done to her, made them swear vengeance, and then took her own life rather than live as anyone's excuse. Over her body, the story says, her kinsmen swore something larger than revenge, that Rome would never again be ruled by kings. We may treat the details as legend, like the wolf, like the plow furrow. The record here is story, not document, and honesty requires saying so. But this much is solid. At some point, roughly 5 centuries before the birth of Christ, the Romans expelled their monarchy, and they came out of the experience with a horror of the word king that would last, astonishingly, for the rest of this entire series. Centuries on, the most powerful Romans alive would still twist themselves into knots to avoid that one syllable. Remember Tarquin. Everyone in this story will. And so the town by the ford stood for the first time, with no one above it. A city of farmers and shepherds and priests, holding its breath in the space where a king had been. What do you build in that space? If not a crown, what? Their answer would take 2 centuries of quarreling to finish, and it would become, long after Rome itself had risen and fallen, one of the most argued over inventions in the history of the world. They called it simply the public thing, in their tongue, res publica, the republic. That is where we go next. Chapter 3. The Republic of the Fathers. Before we follow Rome out into the world, and she is going out into the world, further than anyone on those 7 hills could have dreamed, we need to stop and understand the thing the Romans built in the space where their kings had been. Everything that follows in this story, the glory and the ruin alike, grows out of this invention. So let us take this chapter slowly and get to know the Republic, not as a diagram, but as a way of living. A thing you could hear in the forum at dawn and smell in a farmhouse kitchen and feel in the weight of a debt. Start with the fear. The Romans had rid themselves of a king, and their deepest political instinct, from that day forward, was terror of ever having another. So when they rebuilt their state, they built it the way you build a fence around something dangerous. Power itself was the dangerous thing. They did not pretend otherwise, and every rule they made was a way of caging it. The cage had 3 bars, and they are simple enough to say in a breath. First, power was split. In place of 1 king, the Romans each year chose 2 chief magistrates, the consuls, and gave the pair, jointly, most of what a king had held: command of the armies, the summoning of assemblies. But each consul could block the other. One word, I forbid, from either, and the other's act was void. Power with a twin, forever looking sideways at itself. Second, power was brief. The consuls served 1 year. 1. Then they stepped down, back into the crowd of citizens, subject to the laws they had enforced and the enemies they had made. A Roman magistrate was a man borrowing the state on a short loan, with his neighbors watching. And third, power was watched. There was the Senate, a standing council of elders, former magistrates, the heads of the great families, several hundred men who held no formal command, and yet, by weight of experience and prestige, steered nearly everything: the treasury, the embassies, the long game. The Romans called these men the fathers, and beneath and around them, there was the citizenry itself, gathered in its assemblies out in the open air, voting on laws, on war and peace, and on which men would hold office at all. That is the whole machine. At its simplest, 2 consuls, 1 year, the fathers advising, the people voting. The Republic was a set of promises the Romans made to one another, and the greatest promise was this: no man above the rest, ever again. Now, where does such a machine live? Not in a palace. There was no palace. It lived out loud, in that drained valley between the hills. Here is where the seed we planted last chapter breaks ground. In the Forum, power in Rome had to speak. A man who wanted a law passed, or a war declared, or simply wanted to matter, had to stand up on the speaker's platform in front of his assembled neighbors, farmers in from the country, craftsmen, veterans, creditors and debtors, friends and enemies, and persuade them with nothing but his voice, his reputation, and his argument. The Romans made a high art of this, and something close to a religion. The voice in the forum was, in a real sense, the republic itself, the sound of power asking permission. Hold on to that sound. As long as it is honest, the republic is alive. When, much later in our story, the voice in the forum becomes an echo of decisions already made elsewhere, by generals, by money, by fear, you will know the republic is dying, whatever its institutions still claim. The voice is the pulse. We will keep checking it, and since we are here, let us hear it once at full strength. We may picture a single assembly day, somewhere in the Middle Republic, from darkness to verdict. It begins before dawn, with the augur on his height, the same silent watching of the sky we saw a chapter ago, for no assembly may meet if heaven objects, and with a crier walking the still dark streets, calling the citizens to the forum. They come in with the light, the townsmen first, then the countrymen who set out overnight, mud to the knee, togas over their arms, filling the open ground in their hundreds and then their thousands, until the forum is a single standing crowd, smelling of wool, wood smoke, and the morning's bread. The presiding consul takes the platform. The question of the day, a law proposed or a war weighed, is read out in full, in the old formulas, slowly, because most of the crowd will never read it. Then the speakers, for and against, one after another through the climbing morning, an old senator whose grandfather's name still buys him silence, a tribune, blunt as a hammer, jabbing toward the debtors in the crowd, and the crowd itself all the while a living instrument, murmuring, swaying, roaring at a hit, going terribly quiet at a truth. There is no vote yet. There is only the voice, hour upon hour, doing in the open air the work that in other lands is done behind a palace door. And then, past noon, the talking ends and the counting begins. The crowd sorted into its voting units, filing man by man across the wooden bridges to give each his word to the tellers, the tallies mounting unit by unit through the afternoon, until, toward the cooling of the day, the result is read from the platform to the packed and hushed square, and the thing is done. Not by a king, by a field full of farmers out loud under the open sky. That, whatever its flaws, and we have not hidden them, is what the Romans meant by the public thing. But we should be honest about who, at first, that voice belonged to. The fathers, the old aristocratic families, the patricians, began the republic holding nearly everything. The offices, the priesthoods, the knowledge of the law itself, which was unwritten and lived in their memories like a family secret. Everyone else, the great majority, the plebeians, the plain body of citizen farmers and craftsmen, carried the republic's burdens, its taxes, and its wars, without its keys. The plebeians' answer, when it came, was magnificent and very Roman. They went on strike. Not against a workshop, against the state itself. In the tradition's telling, the plebeians simply walked out of Rome in a body to a hill outside the city and sat down and let the fathers contemplate a Rome with no one to plow its fields or fill its legions. They did this, tradition says, more than once across the early republic, and each time they walked back in with something won. They won their own officers, the tribunes of the plebs, protectors whose persons were declared sacred and untouchable, and who held that same terrible little power of the word no, now wielded upward on behalf of the ordinary citizen, and they won something even deeper. The law, written down. Around half a century into the Republic's life, the laws of Rome were carved onto 12 tablets and set up in the Forum, in the open, where any citizen could stand and read, or have read to him, exactly what the rules were. Much of their content, to our ears, is archaic and harsh, but the principle underneath was a hinge of history. The law is public property. It belongs to no family, no priesthood, no king. Among Rome's greatest exports, in the very long run, will be not her legions, but this idea. 2 centuries of that grinding, patient, mostly bloodless struggle between the orders slowly pried the Republic open, office by office, until plebeians could hold nearly everything, and a new elite of old blood and new merit governed together. Slowly, unevenly, and never completely, Rome remained a steep and unequal society by any measure. But the struggle itself had taught Rome a habit that would mark her for centuries. The fiercest quarrels could be settled inside the walls, by law and vote and stubborn negotiation, without the city drinking its own blood. Keep that habit in mind. Its loss, far ahead of us, will be the beginning of the end. So much for the state. Now come down from the speaker's platform and let us see what the Republic looked like from inside a house, because no Roman experienced the Constitution as a diagram. He experienced it as a household, a web of duties, and a morning walk we are about to take. The Roman household was a small kingdom, the one place monarchy survived. At its head stood the father, the pater familias, holding an authority over his household that Roman law made almost absolute, an authority that in the oldest law reached, at least on parchment, to life and death itself. In practice, custom, affection, and the opinion of the neighbors softened what the law allowed. But the shape of the thing is the point. Romans were raised inside a hierarchy, under a face at the head of the table, and they carried that shape with them into everything they built. And the household had its own religion, older and more intimate than anything in the temples. By the hearth stood a small shrine, and in Roman belief the house itself was full of quiet presences, the spirits of the family's ancestors, the guardians of the larder and the doorway and the boundary stone, the little gods of the private world. Each morning they were greeted. At each meal, a morsel was set aside for them. The fire, as in the huts on the hill centuries before, was tended as something owed. In Roman belief, a family that kept faith with its household spirits kept its luck. The great public rites in the Forum were only this hearth piety, scaled up to the size of a city. Around every household of standing, meanwhile, there stretched a web the Romans considered as natural as weather, the bond of patron and client. A patron was a man of means and influence. His clients were lesser men, the poor, the newly arrived, the freed, attached to his house by loyalty and need. He protected them, spoke for them in court, lent in hard seasons, stood godfather to their ambitions. They supported him, swelled his escort in the Forum, voted his way, added their voices to his name. It was not friendship exactly, and not employment. It was a chain of obligation running from the top of Roman society to the bottom, and every morning, in every street, you could watch it being renewed. We may picture one such morning in the early Republic through the eyes of a client, a smallholder, let us say, whose farm 2 hours outside the city is mortgaged thin. He rises long before light, in the dark of the huts and low houses, puts on the toga he keeps folded for exactly this, the heavy woolen half-circle of cloth, awkward to drape alone, that marks a man as a citizen about citizens' business, and walks into town by the light of the setting stars, joining, as the streets converge, a quiet traffic of other men on the same errand, each bound for the door of his own patron. At the patron's house he waits in the gray outside the door with the rest, a mason, a freedman, a veteran, a cousin from the country. No one has to explain anything. This is the oldest routine in Rome. At first light the door is opened, and the clients file into the entrance hall, where the household shrine stands with its morning offering already made, the little bronze figures of the house gods catching the lamplight, and there they greet the patron, each in turn, by name. And he greets each of them by name, which is half of what they came for. Our smallholder, when his turn comes, speaks quietly about the debt on his land. The patron listens, asks 2 questions, says he will speak to the creditor, who owes him a favor older than both their fathers. That is all. It is enough. On the way out, a slave of the household, and let us note him, this man standing at the door with the basket, because his presence in this scene is entirely ordinary, and we will not pretend otherwise, hands each departing client a small dole of food or coin, the morning's courtesy. And then our man walks home in the risen sun, 2 hours back to his fields, his toga over his arm, a citizen of the Republic, poor, obligated, protected, enrolled, and, when the assembly is called or the legion is mustered, counted. Counted is the word to end on, because now we can say what the Republic actually ran on. Not oil, not gold, obligation. The client owed the patron owed his clients, the son owed the father, the family owed its dead. The citizen owed the city his vote in the assembly and his body in the legion. And the city, this was the Roman wager, owed the citizen law, land, and standing in return. A Roman's rank was measured substantially in duties performed, the harvests brought in, the campaigns served, the offices held honestly. And the fiercest force in Roman life, stronger than greed and very nearly stronger than fear, was the public gaze, the unbearable weight of the neighbor's opinion. To be seen to fail one's obligations was, for a Roman, a kind of death before dying. For that whole world in one man, the Romans told the story of Cincinnatus, and told it for centuries, to every schoolchild, the way we might tell of a founding saint. A former consul, the story goes, fallen on hard times, working his own few acres beyond the Tiber. An enemy traps a Roman army in the hills. The state despairs, and the Senate's messengers find Cincinnatus at his plow and hail him, sweat, dirt, and all, as dictator. The Republic's rarely used emergency office, absolute command, strictly temporary, for the storm alone. He wipes his hands, puts on the toga his wife brings out to him, takes command, rescues the army, and then, the entire point of the story, with supreme power in his hands and no one able to stop him, he lays it down, 16 days into a 6-month term, and goes back to his plow. Whether it happened just so, we cannot promise. It has the polish of a parable. But nations reveal themselves in the stories they insist on, and Rome insisted on this one. The greatest Roman is the one who gives power back. Keep Cincinnatus standing quietly at the edge of this whole series. Nearly everyone we meet from here on will be measured, in the end, against a man walking back to his plow. Now widen the lens one last time, Because while the orders struggled and the clients queued, Rome was growing. And we can let 2 centuries of it pass like weather in the dissolving way this series keeps faith with. Year upon year, the citizen legions mustered in spring, the same smallholders and clients we have been walking with, now with shield and spear, their farms waiting behind them. And year upon year, the ring of Rome's reach widened. The old Etruscan rival across the river worn down at last. A terrible interruption, once, when raiders out of the north broke in and burned Rome herself. A humiliation the city never forgot and spent a generation repairing. Then the long, grinding mountain wars against the tough hill peoples of the interior. And at the end, on the southern coasts, a collision with the Greek cities and the brilliant warrior king they shipped in from over the sea, whose victories over Rome cost him so dearly that his name survives mostly in the phrase for a win not worth its price. He went home. Rome stayed. And here is the thing to understand, more important than any battle, what Rome did with the defeated. She did not, as a rule, erase them. She bound them. City by city, people by people, the beaten were folded into a web of alliances, some given Roman citizenship outright, some given its private rights without the vote, all obliged to send soldiers to fight alongside the legions. It was the logic of the Sabine story, the open door made into a system. Yesterday's enemy, tomorrow's manpower. By the time the peninsula was hers, Rome could lose armies, and soon, terribly, she would, and still raise more, from a deep well of allied Italy that no rival power of her age could match. Rome's true weapon was never the sword. It was the ability to keep losing longer than anyone else could keep winning. One more thing was built in those years, and with it we close the chapter, because it points like an arrow at everything to come. Toward the end of the great mountain wars, a censor named Appius Claudius, a hard, visionary, imperious man of exactly the breed the Republic bred, spent the public treasure on 2 works of engineering. One brought clean water into the city through a covered channel, the first aqueduct, ancestor of marvels we will meet in their glory later. The other was a road, not a track, not the trodden ribbon of mud we left by the ford 2 chapters ago, but that track's true descendant and its transfiguration. A road engineered, surveyed straight across the grain of the countryside, bedded in layered stone and gravel, cambered to shed the rain, paved in fitted blocks of hard volcanic rock, running south from Rome day after day of walking toward the frontier of the moment. Its purpose was blunt. Legions moving fast in any weather, in any season. Mud no longer had a vote. They named it after its maker, the Appian Way. Romans themselves came to call it the Queen of Roads, and it was only the first. From this stone seed will grow, over the coming centuries, a network of such roads flung across 3 continents, the nervous system of everything this story becomes. When we began, the road was a shepherd's path to the ford. Watch it from here on. Wherever this story goes, the road now goes first. Stand then where a traveler of that age might stand, on the crest of the Queen of Roads, south of the city, looking back at Rome on her hills, the temples on the heights, the smoke of the hearths, the forums murmur out of sight, but never quite out of mind. The peninsula behind that traveler is, by treaty and muster roll, Rome's. The Republic's machine, consuls, senate, tribunes, assemblies, the whole caged and quarrelsome contraption, has carried her further than any king did. And then turn, as the traveler turns, and look the other way down the road, south to where the land runs out at the strait and the sea begins. Across that sea, 3 days' sail, no more, lies a city older than Rome, richer than Rome. Mistress of the western waters, her ships have ruled for centuries. Her sailors know every harbor from Africa to Spain. Her name will become, in Roman mouths, a word like a bell tolling. Carthage. The Republic of the Fathers is about to meet the sea. That is where we go next. Chapter 4. Carthage and the Sea. Now the story turns to the sea, and we should begin by admitting that the Romans, at this point in their history, hardly knew what the sea was. They were land people to the bone. Plowmen, hill fighters, road builders. Their river, yes. The Tiber was in their blood, ford and flood and ferry. But the open Mediterranean, the deep water beyond the river's mouth, belonged to other peoples and had for as long as anyone could say. Above all, it belonged to Carthage. Carthage was older than Rome. She had been founded on the coast of North Africa, where the city of Tunis stands today, by Phoenician sailors out of the old harbor towns of the eastern Mediterranean, the same restless, brilliant, seafaring people who had scattered trading posts along these shores for centuries and given the world the very alphabet we met working its way up Italy. While Rome was still thatch and sheep, Carthage was already stone quays and counting houses, a merchant republic governed by wealthy families and elected magistrates, not so unlike Rome in her bones, it must be said, but facing the water, always the water. Her twin harbors were the wonder of the West, an outer basin for the merchantmen, and behind it a great circular inner harbor, ringed with covered slipways, where warships waited in the shade like blades in a drawer. Her wealth came from everywhere the water touched, silver out of Spain, grain and olives from her rich African fields, cloth, ivory, and the carrying trade of the whole Western Sea. Her hired armies and her fleets kept the peace of her markets. For generations, Rome and Carthage had barely brushed against one another. There were even old treaties between them, drawn up when Rome was small, in which Carthage politely fenced Roman ships out of her waters, and Rome, having scarcely any ships, politely agreed. 2 republics then, one a mistress of the sea at her ease, one a muscle-bound newcomer filling the peninsula behind her. Between them lay Sicily, the great 3-cornered island in the strait, wealthy, Greek, quarrelsome, and close enough to Italy's toe that you can see it across the water. It was Sicily that struck the spark. The occasion, when it came, was small and squalid. A mercenary garrison in a Sicilian port town appealing to both powers at once for protection, and we will not untangle its lawyers' details here. What matters is that both republics answered and found themselves eye to eye across the strait, and neither would step back. Out of that little door came more than a century of intermittent, world-changing war. 3 wars, which history calls the Punic Wars, from the Romans' name for the Phoenician people of Carthage. Taken together, they are the hinge of Rome's whole story, the ordeal that turned an Italian power into a Mediterranean one, and, as we shall see, began quietly to turn the Republic into something its founders would not have recognized. The first war was the War of the Sea, and it began with something close to comedy. Rome, resolving to fight a naval empire, owned essentially no navy. What she did next tells you everything about the Roman temperament. A Carthaginian warship ran aground and fell into Roman hands. The Romans hauled it up on the beach, took it apart, studied it timber by timber, and copied it, by the score, in a matter of months. while crews of farm boys practiced their oar strokes sitting on benches built on dry land. The first fleets Rome launched were crude, heavy, badly sailed, floating copies crewed by beginners. Carthaginian admirals bred to the water for generations can be forgiven their laughter. The laughter did not last, because the Romans, knowing they could not outsail anyone, refused to fight a sailing war. They fitted their clumsy ships with a device their enemies came to loathe: a hinged boarding bridge, mounted at the bow, with an iron spike beneath its far end. Let the elegant Carthaginian dance her circles. The moment she came close, the bridge crashed down, the spike bit her deck, and she was no longer in a sea battle at all. She was pinned fast, and up the bridge, in files of two, came Roman legionaries with their short swords, turning the deep water into the one battlefield they knew: dry land at sword's length. It worked. Not cheaply. Nothing in this war was cheap. The sea itself was the crueler enemy. Storm after storm caught the top-heavy Roman fleets on open water, and in the worst of them, by some ancient reckonings, more Romans drowned in an afternoon than most wars killed in years. Any people might have quit. Rome's answer, each time, was the answer we learned to expect last chapter: build another fleet. Tax the fathers, muster the allies, cut the timber, and build another fleet. After nearly a quarter century of this, it was Carthage, richer, wiser on the water, but shallower in men and stubbornness, who asked for terms. Sicily became the first Roman possession beyond the mainland, the first stone, though no one used such words yet, of an empire. Before we sail on, let us spend a night at sea ourselves, because this chapter should not pass without our feeling what those years actually asked of the men who rowed them. We may picture one warship of the fleet on the night crossing to Sicily in the middle years of that first long war. She is a quinquereme, 120 feet of Italian pine and oak, low in the water, smelling of pitch, salt, and crowded men. Below the deck, in the dark, 300 rowers sit their benches in tiered ranks, and it is worth pausing on who they are, because the galley slave of legend belongs mostly to later ages and other fleets. These men are, in the main, free, the poorest class of Roman citizens, too poor for legion service, and boys from the allied coastal towns whose treaties owe Rome crews. Only in the most desperate hours of this century will Rome row enslaved men, and then with freedom held out as the wage. Free then. But freedom buys no comfort here. Each man has his 18 inches of bench, the oar loom smooth as bone under his calluses, and the stroke, all night, the stroke, set by a mallet on a block, slow and endless as a heartbeat, 2,000 pulls in a watch. On deck, the Marines sleep in their cloaks in ordered rows between the rails, swords beside them, while the sailing master stands aft by the twin steering oars, reading his course the only way this age knows how at night, by the stars over the masthead and the loom of headlands darker than the dark. Somewhere off the beam, unseen, the rest of the squadron keeps station by the sound of one another's oars, and down the benches, quietly, against the rhythm of the mallet, the rowers do what oarsmen have always done. They murmur. About the bread and sour wine at dawn, about a storm 2 summers back, and the ships that did not come out of it, and the names in it that were their cousins' names. About the farm at home, whose plowing is falling this year to a wife, a grandfather, a boy of 9. The oar rises, falls, rises, the ship breathes. Above them all, The same stars that stood over a shepherd boy's hillside 3 centuries before slide slowly toward Sicily. Hold those men in mind. The crossing took thousands of such nights. And now let the years turn, because the second war is coming, and the second war has a face. Carthage, defeated, had not been destroyed. She had been humiliated, stripped of Sicily, and then, in her weakness, of more islands, and made to pay. Her answer, over the following decades, was to build a new dominion in the silver-rich country of Spain. And it was out of Spain, when the war's embers found their tinder again, that there marched one of the most dangerous enemies Rome would face in all her 1,000 years. His name was Hannibal. He was the son of Carthage's great general of the First War, raised on campaign, and Roman tradition itself preserved the story that as a boy of 9, at his father's side and his father's altar, he had sworn an oath never to be a friend to Rome. Rome would spend 17 years learning what that oath was worth. What Hannibal did in the war's first autumn has never stopped astonishing anyone. Rome held the sea now. The straight road to Italy was closed. So he took the road that did not exist. He marched an army out of Spain, infantry, cavalry, and the great war elephants of Africa, across the breadth of southern Gaul, and then up, in the closing weeks of the year, into the Alps themselves, into the ice, the treacherous high passes, the ambushes of the mountain tribes, the animals lost screaming down the slopes. The crossing consumed by the ancient accounts, something near half his army. What came down out of the mountains into Italy that first winter was gaunt, frostbitten, and reduced. And it proceeded, over the next 2 years, to do to Rome what no enemy had done in living memory. Twice in those first years he met Roman armies in the field, and twice he broke them, once luring an army along a fog-bound lakeshore into a trap that killed a consul and his legions in a morning. And then, in the third summer, in the flat farm country of the southeast, came the day the Romans would measure disasters against for the rest of their history. The place was called Cannae. Rome and her allies put into the field the largest army the Republic had yet assembled, resolved to end this by sheer weight. Hannibal, outnumbered, let the great mass drive into his deliberately yielding center, and then closed his African veterans and his cavalry around its flanks and rear like 2 hands cupping. What followed, we will not narrate. This series does not choreograph killing. The historian's arithmetic is enough, and it should be said plainly and once. On that single day of high summer, in a few afternoon hours, Roman and Allied dead were counted in the tens of thousands. By the ancient figures, some 50 or 60,000 men, among them a consul and officers of the state by the score, and a measurable fraction of every family of standing in Rome. Proportioned against Rome's citizen body, it was one of the most devastating single days the Republic ever endured. That is the fact. Let it be heavy, and let it lie. In the histories of most nations, Cannae is where the story ends. What makes Rome Rome is that it is not even where the chapter ends. The city did not sue for peace. The Senate, the tradition records, went out formally to thank the surviving consul, the man on whose watch the catastrophe had fallen, for not despairing of the Republic. The word defeat was, in effect, banned from negotiation. Rome would not treat while an enemy stood on Italian soil. And then the Republic did what we watched her learn to do. She reached into the deep well. New legions were raised from boys and elders. In that darkest hour, even enslaved men were enrolled, with freedom as their promised wage. And the muster went on. And the great wager of the alliance system paid its dividend. Though some of the southern cities went over to the invader, the heart of allied Italy, bled white at Cannae alongside Rome, held. The well did not run dry. The years that followed we can let pass in a phrase, as the Romans themselves nearly did. Years of deliberate patience, of shadowing the invincible enemy while refusing him battle, of retaking lost towns one by one and burning the summer country he needed to live from. An unglamorous strategy, mocked in the Forum while it slowly won the war. Hannibal remained in Italy some 15 years, unbeaten in the field and progressively starved of everything but victories. And meanwhile, Rome, in her methodical way, raised up a commander of her own generation, a young man whose family Cannae's generation of wars had gutted, named Publius Cornelius Scipio. Rome sent him first to Spain, where he tore up the roots of Carthage's western wealth, and then, over furious objections in the Senate, he carried the war at last where it had never gone, to Africa, to the fields of Carthage herself. It achieved in one stroke what 15 years of fighting in Italy had not. Hannibal was recalled at last to defend his own city. On an African plain called Zama, the two greatest soldiers of the age finally faced one another, and it was the Roman who left the field in command of it. Carthage capitulated. Her fleet was surrendered and burned in sight of her own harbor. Her empire was signed away. Her wars, henceforth, required Rome's permission. The Second War was over. Rome, without yet using the word, was now the mistress of the Western Mediterranean. And something else had happened, quietly, that we must mark before the last act. Rome had discovered the war hero. Scipio came home to a triumph and a surname taken from the continent he had conquered, his personal glory towering over the institutions that had employed him. And thoughtful Romans were already uneasy. The Republic's whole design, remember, was the cage. Power split, brief, and watched. A general adored by his veterans, and half the public was a thing the cage had not been built for. The fathers found ways, in time, to clip and humble even Scipio, but a door had been shown to exist. In the last chapters of Part 1, we will watch men far less scrupulous walk through it. There remains the Third War, and it is the shortest and the darkest, and we will give it the honesty it demands and no theatrics. Half a century passed. Carthage, stripped of empire and army, did what merchant cities do. She traded and recovered and grew rich again in her African garden. Harmless now by every military measure, but visibly, gallingly prosperous. And in Rome, where the memory of Hannibal was a scar that itched at every reverse, there were men who could not abide her existence. Tradition remembers one aged senator above all. We need not add his name to our count, who ended every speech he gave, on any subject whatever, with the same flat sentence: Carthage must be destroyed. Year upon year, the sentence fell like a dripping tap, and year upon year the mood in the Forum hardened around it, until at last, seizing on a treaty technicality, when Carthage dared defend herself against a neighbor's raids, Rome delivered demands designed to be undeceivable. The Carthaginians were to abandon their city, their harbors, their temples, their ancestors' graves, and rebuild, if they wished, inland, away from the sea that was their whole life. It was a demand for a people to stop existing as themselves. They refused, as they were meant to, and Rome declared her war. The end came in the spring of the year we count as 146 before the birth of Christ, roughly 21.5 centuries ago. And here this series pays one of its standing debts in full. because what happened deserves one plain, honest paragraph, without poetry. After 3 years of siege and blockade, the legions broke into Carthage, and for 6 days and nights they fought through it street by street, burning as they went, while a starving population resisted from the rooftops. The ancient accounts describe the city dying block by block, houses pulled down upon their defenders, the wounded and the dead cleared into pits together in the army's haste. When the citadel surrendered, the survivors of a city that had held perhaps 500,000 or more came out to the number of some 50,000. And these men, women, and children, the great bulk of everyone still alive, were sold into slavery, scattered to the markets and households and fields of the Mediterranean, as was the standing custom of ancient war, and now, increasingly, the engine of Rome's own economy. The city itself was then systematically demolished and burned over days, its territory annexed, its very site given over to curse and legend. One of the great civilizations of the Western Sea, her language, her libraries, her 7 centuries of memory, was, in one season, made to stop. And in that same year, at the other end of the Mediterranean, Rome's legions also destroyed Corinth, one of the storied cities of Greece, and enslaved her survivors likewise. There was no longer any power on the Middle Sea that could tell Rome no. That is what happened. We do not soften it, and we move on. But we do not move on before standing, for a moment, where the Roman commander stood, because the ancient record preserves, from inside that week, one of the most haunting scenes in all of Roman history, and it was set down by a man who was present. The historian Polybius, a Greek, brought to Rome years before as a political hostage, and by now the friend and companion of the commanding general, a grandson by adoption of the great Scipio, records that he stood beside that general as Carthage burned below them. And the general, gazing at the destruction he had himself been ordered to complete and had completed, wept. He spoke aloud, Polybius tells us, old lines from Homer, the poet's prophecy that holy Troy, too, would one day perish with her people. And when Polybius asked him what he meant by them, the general answered that he was not thinking of Carthage. He was thinking of Rome, that a day might come, in the turning of things, when this same fate would find his own city. Hold that. Rome's own conqueror, at the summit of Rome's power, looking into the fire and seeing the far end of this series. The Romans kept that story and retold it, which tells you they understood it. Whether they could act on the understanding, whether anyone can, is one of the questions the rest of these hours will slowly answer. For now, the fleets turned home, and it is with the homecoming, not the burning, that this chapter must end, because the ships riding low in the water toward the Tiber's mouth were low with the weight of a transformed world. Into Italy, year after year now, flowed the plunder of the Mediterranean, the silver of Spain and the treasuries of kings, the art of Greece, statues and paintings by the shipload, torn from cities like Corinth to stand in Roman halls, grain from Sicily and Africa in quantities that made Italian farms look quaint. And with the treasure came the people, the enslaved, in numbers no earlier age of Rome had ever imagined. The 50,000 of Carthage, the survivors of Corinth, the captives of a dozen lesser wars, marching in coffles down the Queen of Roads to the markets, the mines, the kitchens, and the fields of the victors. Rome had gone out to the sea a republic of smallholders and come back the owner of the world's labor and the world's gold. Every triumph in history sends the bill later. The soldiers on those ships, the rowers we sailed with, the legionaries of the deep well, were coming home, after years away, to farms mortgaged, neglected, or already swallowed by wealthier neighbors. And the wealth on those ships was about to remake the very countryside they had fought for, in ways none of them had voted on. The Republic had defeated every enemy on the face of the sea. What no one yet knew was whether she could survive the prize. That reckoning, the flood of gold, the fields full of the enslaved, the city swelling beyond every precedent, and the first brothers who died trying to call it by its name, is where we go next. Chapter 5. The Price of Victory. Rome had won everything. This chapter is about what winning cost. We left the fleets turning for home, riding low with the treasure of a broken Mediterranean, and it would be easy, the Romans themselves found it easy, to imagine that the story from here is simply more. More provinces, more triumphs, more marble. And there will be more. But before we follow the standards any further outward, we have to stay home for a while, in Italy, and watch what all that victory did to the victor. Because the next 100 years of this story, the fall of the Republic itself, begins not on any battlefield, but in the fields and streets we are about to walk. Begin with the money, because the money came first, and the money changed everything. Into Rome, in the decades after Carthage, poured wealth of a kind, and on a scale that Italy had never held. The silver of the Spanish mines, now Roman mines, the accumulated treasuries of Eastern kings, the yearly tribute of provinces, the grain of Sicily and Africa arriving as taxes rather than trade. And this river of wealth did not spread evenly across the Roman people. Rivers never do. It ran in deep, narrow channels to the men positioned at its banks, the senators who governed the new provinces, the commanders who took the plunder, the syndicates of contractors who farmed the taxes and supplied the legions. Within a generation or two, Rome contained private fortunes that could have ransomed the old republic several times over, held by families who now competed with one another not in the old currency of offices held and duty done, but in the new one. Display. Townhouses like small palaces, Greek statues in the garden, banquets that became legends. The old fathers grumbled. There were laws passed against luxury, solemn and completely ineffective. But the deeper change was quieter, and it happened in the countryside. Think back to the smallholder we walked with 2 chapters ago, the client with the mortgaged farm, the citizen soldier of the deep well. Rome's whole military machine, remember, rested on men like him. The law itself required a man to hold property before he could serve in the legions, on the old logic that a man defends best what he owns. Now follow him through the wars we have just witnessed. He is mustered for Spain or Africa or Greece, not for a summer, as in his grandfather's day, when the enemy was a valley away, but for years at a time, oceans from home. And while he is gone, his fields wait on a wife, an aging father, a hired hand, through drought years and flood years, with the debt still breathing beneath it all. Some such farms survived. Very many did not. And when the veteran came home, if he came home, and found the land sold or seized for debt, there was always a buyer waiting, because the men enriched by the wars were hungry for exactly one thing: land, the only investment a Roman senator considered entirely respectable. Farm by farm, valley by valley, across great stretches of Italy, the small holdings were swallowed into estates of a new kind and a new scale, vast consolidated properties, run for profit, producing wine and oil and wool for the markets of a Mediterranean that Rome now owned. And these estates did not need the smallholder even as a laborer, because the same wars that had broken his farm had flooded Italy with something cheaper than his wages: human beings. Here this series pays another of its standing debts, and pays it fully, because we have now arrived at the place where slavery stops being an element of Rome's story and becomes part of its foundation. And it will remain in the foundation, visible wherever we look closely, for every remaining hour of this series. So let us look closely now, once, without flinching. The enslaved of Italy in these generations came from everywhere the legions had been. The 50,000 of Carthage and the survivors of Corinth, whom we watched march down the Queen of Rhodes. Spaniards and Gauls taken in the frontier wars. Greeks and Syrians sold out of the eastern campaigns and the slave markets that fed on them. One Aegean island's port became notorious, ancient writers claimed, for the tens of thousands who could change hands there in a single day. They were farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, musicians, scribes. They had names, gods, languages, and families, all of it now legally erased. Roman law was unsentimental about what they had become. Property. A speaking tool, one Roman writer on farm management called the slave, in a phrase that has never stopped chilling readers, listing him among the equipment of an estate, after the oxen and before the wagons. On the great estates, enslaved men worked the vines and the olive groves in gangs, often under overseers who were slaves themselves, and slept on the harsher properties, in barracks that the Romans called by a word meaning simply the workhouse, in the worst cases, chained at night. In the mills and bakeries, they turned the stones. On the ranches of the South, they ranged with the herds, half-wild themselves, armed against wolves and rustlers, a detail worth remembering, for it will return. And in the mines, the Spanish silver mines above all, the very source of the river of money we began with, they endured what even ancient writers, no sentimentalists, recorded with horror. A Greek historian who saw those mines wrote that the enslaved there, working underground day and night, wasted and died in numbers beyond counting, their bodies broken by the labor, wishing, these are the substance of his words, that death would come, and finding it better than life. Rome's silver coinage, the money in every purse in this story from here forward, came out of that darkness. That is said once, plainly, and it stands for every coin we mention hereafter. In the city, slavery wore a different face, many different faces, and honesty requires showing the range. The households of the rich ran on enslaved labor. Cooks, cleaners, litter-bearers, doorkeepers. One famous house was said to keep a doorkeeper on a chain, like a watchdog. But there were also enslaved Greeks tutoring senators' sons in philosophy, enslaved secretaries and physicians and architects, some living more comfortably than free laborers in the tenements, and, a thing that made Rome genuinely unusual among slaveholding societies, a real and well-worn door out. Roman masters freed slaves in great numbers, and a freed slave of a citizen became a citizen. A client of his old master, marked by origin, barred from office himself, but his children fully Roman. The open door again, the same instinct we met with the Sabines, extended even here, and within a few generations a striking share of the city's population, and eventually of Rome's poets, entrepreneurs, and imperial administrators, would descend from the enslaved. None of which unmakes the chains, the barracks, or the mines. Both truths, held together, are Rome. a system of astonishing absorptive generosity, resting its full weight on a floor of human property. This series will not let go of either half. Now, the dispossessed. Where does the broken smallholder go? The veteran without a farm, the countryman priced out of his own valley. He goes to Rome. They all went to Rome. Through these decades, the city swelled past all its old precedents. The dispossessed of Italy flowing in along the roads, the freed slaves and their children, the traders and craftsmen and fortune hunters of a whole sea drawn to where the money was. Rome had long since burst any wall or plan. She was becoming, and would then remain for centuries, the largest city in the world. Say that plainly once, and let it stand, because we will stand inside it for the rest of this series. The largest city in the world. Not the loveliest, travelers from the marble cities of the Greek East often found her crowded, muddy, and chaotic. But the largest, the loudest, and the center of everything. Let us walk it. We may picture the city on an autumn afternoon in the age of the Gracchi, say, a dozen years after Carthage burned, beginning down at the river. The Tiber wharves first, below the island and the old ford, barges nose to tail along the bank, grain from Africa coming up in sacks on the backs of porters, wine jars, marble, oil, timber, the shouting of tally clerks in 3 languages, and everywhere the smell of the river, mud, fish, tar, the same river underneath it all, that a shepherd boy watched from his hillside 7 centuries before. Up from the wharves, into the flat ground of the markets, the cattle market by the river, the vegetable sellers, the streets of the silversmiths and the perfume dealers, the porticos where the money changers work their scales, and the slave dealers work their platforms. We said we would not look away, and we do not. Then upward and inward, as the afternoon thickens toward evening, into the valleys between the hills, where the crowd truly begins. Streets narrowing to the width of a cart, then to the width of 2 laden porters. The ground floors all shops and cook stalls and taverns. The smoke of 1,000 charcoal braziers drifting up between walls that lean toward each other. 4 and 5 stories of timber-frame tenement. Wet laundry overhead. The noise now a single continuous weather of voices, hammers, mules, and somewhere a flute. And as the light fails and the shops begin to shudder, look up once, past the lines of laundry, at the strip of deepening sky between the buildings, and hold in mind, at one edge of the picture, the senator's garden across town, quiet among its stolen Greek statues, and at the other edge, far to the south, the chained barracks of the estates in the darkening countryside. All of it is Rome now. All of it is the price and the prize of victory in one frame. Somebody was bound to stand up in the Forum sooner or later and say out loud that the frame did not hold together. It turned out to be 2 brothers. They were, by blood, almost a summary of the Republic, grandsons, through their mother, of the great Scipio who had beaten Hannibal. That mother, Cornelia, was one of the most respected women in Rome's history, and the Romans told a story about her that every schoolchild learned, how a wealthy visitor displayed her jewels and asked to see Cornelia's, and Cornelia called in her 2 sons and said, "These are my jewels." She educated those sons superbly, and when both were dead, she bore it, the Romans said, with a composure that became as famous as the boys themselves. We will meet the women of this story more fully in their own right elsewhere. Here, let Cornelia stand a moment at the door of the crisis, because it was her house the crisis came from. Her elder son, Tiberius Gracchus, came home from war in Spain, having seen, his own account of it survives in substance. The thing we have just walked through, the Italian countryside emptied of Italians. The fields worked by the enslaved of foreign wars, the citizens who had fought those wars, landless on the roads. The men who fight and die for Italy, he told the forum crowds, and the ancient historians preserve the argument, share the air and the light, and nothing else. They are called masters of the world, and have not one clod of earth of their own. The wild beasts of Italy have their dens, and the soldiers of Italy have none. You can hear, even at this distance, why the crowd went still. It was as true a thing as the forum had heard in a generation, and the forum's voice, at its best, was for exactly this. What Tiberius proposed, as an elected tribune of the plebs, that office created, remember, in the old walkouts, to protect the plain citizen, was not revolution. It was the enforcement, mostly, of an old and ignored law, limiting how much public land any one man could hold, with the recovered land to be parceled out to the landless. But it struck directly at the fortunes of the men who ran the Senate. And when the Senate leaned on another tribune to veto the bill, Tiberius answered with a move as logical as it was unheard of. He had the assembly vote his fellow tribune out of office, on the argument that a tribune who blocks the people's will has ceased to be the people's protector. The bill passed. The Land Commission began its work. Understand what was now happening beneath the surface, because the Romans on both sides understood it perfectly. Two parts of the old constitution, the People's Assembly and the Fathers' Senate, partners in the cage for 3 centuries, were being tested against each other to destruction. And when Tiberius, fearing prosecution the moment his year's immunity ended, stood for a second consecutive tribunate, bending precedent again, the men who hated him stopped answering law with law. What happened deserves its plain paragraph. On election day, in the summer heat, a crowd of senators and their clients, led by the chief priest of Rome himself, came up to the Capitol armed with clubs and the broken legs of benches, and beat Tiberius Gracchus and some 300 of his followers to death. The ancient accounts agree that not one died by the sword. It was bludgeon work, close and unmilitary, and threw the bodies, that night, into the Tiber, denying them even burial. The river that had carried the legend of the twins now carried the first political dead of the Republic's last century. It was remembered, the ancient historians noting it with a kind of horror, as the first bloodshed in Roman civic strife in the 300 and more years since the kings. The long taboo, the habit of settling everything inside the walls without killing, broken in an afternoon by the guardians of order themselves. 10 years later, his younger brother Gaius took up the work, a more brilliant politician than Tiberius, with a program that reached further: land, yes, but also subsidized grain for the city's poor public works, rights for the Italian allies. For 2 years he was nearly the master of Rome, and the Senate's answer, when it came, wore the costume of law, a decree of emergency, the first of its kind, authorizing the consuls to do whatever was needed to protect the state. What was needed, it transpired, was the death of Gaius Gracchus. He had a slave help him to his own end as the hunters closed in, and of his supporters in the thousands, killed in the streets or strangled in prison afterward. And the Tiber again received the bodies. Their mother Cornelia, the story goes, forbade herself mourning and spoke of her sons ever after, calmly, as men of Rome's history. Perhaps that is legend too. It is how Rome chose to remember her. Step back now and see the ledger of this chapter whole. Victory had brought Rome the world's wealth and the world's labor, and in the space of a single lifetime that prize had hollowed the countryside, swollen the city past every precedent, chained a workforce to the fields and the mines, and, when two men of the founding blood tried to say so out loud, the answer, twice, had been massacre, and the answer had worked. That was the true poison, more than the blood itself, the lesson. Every ambitious man in Rome had now seen, twice, that when the argument in the forum truly mattered, the side willing to kill could win and prosper and call it saving the Republic. The Gracchi had come to the argument with laws. The next men would come with armies. That is where we go next. Chapter 6. The Sword in the Forum. We may picture an ordinary morning in the Forum. Winter, thin sunlight, the smell of charcoal and wet stone. Perhaps 40 years after the blood of the Gracchi. The markets are open. The lawyers are pleading. And at the foot of the speaker's platform, where laws and victories have been posted for centuries, whitened boards are hung, freshly lettered, and a crowd stands before them in a silence unlike any other silence in this series. They are reading lists of names, Roman names, senators' names, neighbors' names, published by the state, and every man whose name is on the boards may be killed by anyone, for a reward, his property forfeit, his sons barred from public life. Some in the crowd are reading to learn who is ruined. Some are reading, hearts loud, to learn whether they themselves are already dead men. And some, hooded, unremarkable, are reading the way men read the notices of an auction. No one shouts. That is the detail to keep. In the place built for the voice, before the platform where Tiberius Gracchus once asked whether Italy's soldiers deserved a clod of her earth, the only sound is the crowd's breathing and the tap of the notary's stylus. The forum's voice this morning is a list. Hold that morning. It is where this chapter is going. The chapter's work is to explain how it became possible, how the city of the caged power, the annual consuls, the sacred tribunes, arrived in one long lifetime at whitened boards in the winter forum. And the explanation begins, as Roman explanations so often do, with an army, and with a man who changed what a Roman army was. His name was Gaius Marius. He was what the Romans called a new man. No consular ancestors, no famous name. A blunt, able soldier from a country town, the kind of Roman the old fathers used at need and condescended to at leisure. And he rose, through hard service and harder elections, at exactly the moment Rome's military arithmetic stopped working. Because think back to the requirement we have carried since chapter 3. Only men of property could serve in the legions, and we have just spent a chapter watching the property holders of Italy lose their land. The deep well was failing at its source. Armies were harder to raise every decade, even as wars in Africa, and terrifyingly, against vast migrating tribes on the northern frontier, demanded more of them. Marius's solution, as Roman tradition remembered it, was simple, obvious, and irreversible. He opened the legions to men with nothing. The landless of the city and the countryside, the very dispossessed we walked among last chapter, could now enlist, equipped by the state, for long professional terms. They came in crowds, and Rome, at a stroke, had solved her recruiting crisis and created, without one debate about it in the Senate, a new kind of Roman army, an army of the poor, for whom soldiering was not a citizen's interruption, but a livelihood, and whose one hope of a farm and an old age was the discharge bounty their general might win for them from a grudging Senate. follow the logic one step, as every Roman soon did. Such men's loyalty ran not to the abstraction of the Republic, which had given them nothing, but to the general who fed them, led them, and would fight the politicians for their land. The legions were becoming private followings, clients, in effect, of their commanders, on the old patron model we know well, except that these clients came armed and in tens of thousands. It was Marius, too, tradition records, who gave this new army its emblem. The legions had marched of old under several standards: boar, wolf, horse, and bird together. Marius swept the menagerie away and gave every legion one standard only, the eagle in silver, raised on its pole above the ranks. There it is at last, the bird from the augur's hilltop come down to earth and taken into the army's hands. The sky sign made a possession. The eagle was carried into battle, defended past death, mourned when lost. A legion's soul was said to live in it. And from this chapter forward, when the eagle appears in our story, remember what is now true beneath the reverence. The eagles belong to the generals. The wars themselves we can let pass, as this series does. Victory in Africa, and then, against the northern tribes, a genuine deliverance. Marius, re-elected consul year after year in defiance of every rule in the cage, because the emergency seemed to demand it, destroyed the migrating hosts, and was hailed as the third founder of Rome. Mark only the constitutional wreckage in the wake of the glory. The man had held the supreme office 6 times, most of them consecutively. Power brief, the second bar of the cage, had quietly bent. The Republic kept the forms and forgave the facts, because the facts had saved her. It is how such things always go, one more storm, and then Sulla. In these same years, the question Gaius Gracchus had died partly for, the Italian allies' demand for Roman citizenship, finally burst. The allies, the deep well itself, the peoples who had bled at Rome's side since before Hannibal, wearied of dying for a citizenship they were refused, and rose. And Rome fought, for 2 terrible years, a war against most of Italy. She won it in the field and lost it at the table, in the most Roman resolution imaginable. The citizenship was conceded, wholesale, to nearly everyone south of the Po. The open door forced. Italy, from now on in our story, is Rome, legally and soon in spirit. It was the one great constructive act of this whole destructive age, and it was purchased, like everything else in this chapter, with blood. And out of that war rose the second name we need. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, Marius's former lieutenant, now his rival. A patrician of a faded family, cold where Marius was blunt, cultured, cynical, and, as events would prove, entirely without the particular scruple on which the whole Republic silently rested. The break came over a command. A great war was waiting in the east, a rich war against a king who had massacred Roman citizens by the tens of thousands in a single coordinated day. The historians' figures vary, and all are dreadful. The Senate gave the command to Sulla, the consul of the year. The assembly, steered by a tribune allied to old Marius, took it from him and gave it to Marius. Both moves could dress themselves in law. And Sulla, rather than swallow the reversal, walked out of Rome to his 6 legions. His legions, in every sense Marius had made possible. Poor men, bound to their general, hungry for the bounties of the Eastern War, and asked them, in effect, to choose between the Republic and himself. They chose him. His officers, men of the old families, nearly all refused and fell away. The soldiers did not hesitate, and Sulla marched his army on Rome. Let the plainest sentence in this chapter carry it. What Hannibal had never managed, a Roman consul now did. Armed legions crossed the old sacred boundary of the city, a line no army under arms was meant to cross, and took Rome by force from the Romans. There was fighting in the streets against improvised resistance. There were the first killings. Marius fled into exile with a price on his head. An old man hunted through marshes. The taboo of taboos was gone, broken not by a demagogue of the crowd, but by the Senate's own champion. And every soldier in Italy now carried the knowledge of what 6 loyal legions could be worth. What followed, while Sulla fought his Eastern war, we can pass over at a merciful distance. His enemies retook Rome in his absence. Old Marius came back from the marshes for one final consulship that disgraced his name. Days of killing his rivals without trial, the severed heads of consulars displayed for the first time on the very speaker's platform of the forum, and then died, old and raving, in his bed. The forum's voice, note, now had heads above it. When Sulla returned from the east, victorious and unforgiving, and won the civil war that met him, Rome lay entirely in the hands of a man with no rival, no scruple, and a long memory. And so we arrive back at the winter morning and the whitened boards, and this series pays the debt in full. One plain paragraph, no poetry. The prescriptions, the word means, with terrible mildness, the postings, were the state-organized murder of Sulla's enemies, real and potential and merely wealthy. Lists of the condemned were published in the forum and renewed as fresh names occurred to the victors. The listed could be killed by anyone. Killers were paid from the victims' estates, informers rewarded. Those who sheltered the hunted made liable themselves. The property of the dead was auctioned to Sulla's followers at insider prices, and their sons and grandsons stripped of political rights. The ancient historians, no strangers to bloodshed, recorded this bureaucratized killing with open revulsion and preserved its essence in a single anecdote. A quiet landowner, no politician at all, reading his own name on the boards and crying out that he was a dead man. Hunted down, he understood at once, by his own beautiful estate. The tallies in the sources run to thousands of the condemned, among them a substantial fraction of the Senate itself. The auctions ran for months, and fortunes founded in those months, including, the Romans never forgot, some of the greatest fortunes of the next generation, kept their bloodstain in the public memory for a century. It was the Gracchus lesson, taken to its conclusion. Killing worked, and now killing paid. Sulla, with the state remade to his liking, the tribunes gutted, the Senate packed and restored to primacy, the cage rebuilt as he saw it, with thicker bars, then did the one thing no one expected, the thing that makes him the most unsettling figure in this whole part of the story. He resigned, laid down the dictatorship, dismissed his guards, walked the forum as a private citizen, daring any man to call him to account. None did, and retired to the coast to fish, drink, and write his memoirs, dying in his bed soon after. Cincinnatus, you remember, gave power back and went to his plow, and Rome told the story for centuries as her conscience. Sulla gave power back too, over a city of auctioned houses and fatherless families, and Rome hardly knew what story she was now in. The forms of the Republic stood again, punctiliously restored by the man who had violated every one of them. But forms are not habits, and the old habit, the settling of everything inside the walls without killing, was dead past recall. The young men who had watched Sulla learned not his laws, but his method, and his method fit in one sentence. With enough loyal legions, The Republic is whatever you say it is. One more debt, and this grim chapter can end. In the years just after Sulla, the world we described in Chapter 5, the chained barracks, the ranch gangs, the arena schools where enslaved men were trained to fight for crowds, gave its own terrible answer to Rome. A breakout of gladiators from a training school in the south became a rising, and the rising became an army. Enslaved men and women of the estates in the tens of thousands, under a leader of real genius named Spartacus. And we set his name down plainly. Once, because in a story where the masters are so often the only ones remembered, his is the rare name from below that Rome itself could never manage to forget. For 2 years they defeated Roman armies and marched the length of Italy, seeking, the sources suggest, mostly a way out, home, over the Alps or over the sea, and finding every way closed. It ended as such. Risings ended in the ancient world. The rebel army destroyed in the field, and the 6,000 taken alive crucified by the victor's order along the Queen of Roads itself. The Appian Way, mile after mile of them, from the site of their revolt to the gates of Rome, left standing as a lesson. Rome's roads, we said at their birth, carried the legions and the law. Let it be recorded, once and without adornment, that they were also made to carry this. The rising changed nothing in the system it rose against. The barracks and the platforms and the mines went on as before. But no Roman who traveled that road that year forgot it, and neither will this series. So stands Rome, a lifetime after the Gracchi, mistress of the Mediterranean and unable to keep peace in her own forum. Her armies now instruments with owners, her politics and education in what massacre, march, and prescription can accomplish. And a generation of brilliant, hungry young men coming of age with exactly that education and no other. Among them, a detail the storytellers of Rome always savored, was a young patrician who had actually been on Sulla's lists and talked or lucked his way off them, whose aunt had been old Marius's wife, who was warned, tradition says, by Sulla himself, that in this careless young man there were many Mariuses. He was 19 then. Rome would spend the next 40 years learning what Sulla meant. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar, and he is the whole of our next chapter, the last chapter of the Republic. Chapter 7, Caesar. We come now to the last chapter of the Republic, and to the one name in this whole story that the world never stopped saying. Kings and emperors for 2,000 years would take his family name as a title, Caesar, Kaiser, Tsar, long after anyone remembered it, had begun as the name of one indebted young politician in a city on the Tiber. But do not let the glare of the name blind you to what this chapter really is. It is not the story of a great man destroying a healthy republic. It is the story of a man of immense gifts and immense appetite moving through a republic already broken, walking with better balance than anyone else, across floors that Marius and Sulla had left rotten. We have watched the rot laid down, plank by plank, for 2 chapters. Now we watch it give way. Rome, in the generation after Sulla, belonged first to another man, and we need him before we need Caesar. His name was Pompey, Pompey the Great, a title he had from Sulla while still barely more than a boy, and had the self-delight to keep. He was Sulla's most gifted young officer, and his whole career was a quiet demolition of the restored constitution his old master had left behind. Command after command granted to him outside the rules, because he was simply better at war than anyone else, and the emergencies kept coming. It was Pompey who was handed, by a single extraordinary law, swathes of the whole Mediterranean to clear it of the pirate fleets that had made the sea lawless, and cleared it in a single season. A feat of organization the ancient world never stopped admiring. It was Pompey who then took the great Eastern command, the one Sulla and Marius had first drawn swords over a generation before, and finished it entirely. Kings deposed and installed, new provinces organized from the Black Sea toward the Red, the treasure and tribute of the East nearly doubling Rome's public revenue. He came home the most celebrated soldier of his day, rich beyond counting, with a nickname that deliberately echoed Alexander. And then, mark this, because it is the hinge of his whole life and a last flicker of the old republic's strange power, he came home, landed in Italy at the head of an army that could have taken Rome as easily as Sulla's had, and disbanded it. Sent the legions home, as the law required, and entered the city as a citizen, trusting the Senate to ratify his eastern settlement and reward his veterans with land, as gratitude and justice plainly demanded. The Senate, the old families, jealous of the overmighty new man, led by men who mistook obstruction for principle, refused him both, and spent years savoring the refusal. It is one of the sourest ironies in Roman history. The fathers, given a general who laid his sword down unasked, chose to humiliate him, and so taught him, and every general watching, precisely the lesson the Republic could not afford to teach again. Among those watching was Caesar. Gaius Julius Caesar was Pompey's junior by 6 years, a patrician of the oldest possible blood. His family claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself, through the Trojan prince of the legends, and of almost no money. Nephew by marriage of old Marius, the young man who had been on Sulla's lists and charmed his way off them. What the sources agree on is the temperament, a charm that operated on crowds and creditors alike. Physical courage of the showy, deliberate kind. Generosity on a scale that kept him spectacularly in debt for decades. He spent borrowed fortunes on games and gifts and buildings, buying the love of the Roman street as methodically as other men bought land, and beneath all of it, a cold, patient clarity about where power in the broken republic actually lay. He climbed the ordinary ladder of offices in the ordinary way, trailing scandal and debt, and men who thought themselves serious dismissed him for years as a dandy and a demagogue. Sulla, who had wanted him dead at 19, had judged him better. The arrangement that made him came about because the Senate, with the perfect blindness of that generation, managed to alienate 3 powerful men at once. Pompey, still waiting for his veterans' land, the richest man in Rome, Marcus Crassus, who wanted relief for his tax syndicates, and Caesar, who wanted the consulship and then a great command. The 3 made a private compact. Nothing illegal, nothing even written. Just an understanding that nothing would happen in Rome that displeased any of the 3, and sealed it in the Roman way, with a marriage. Caesar's beloved only daughter was wed to Pompey, and became, by every account, the genuine warmth that held the 2 men together. For most of a decade, this unofficial syndicate quietly owned the Republic, its assemblies, and its elections. The forum's voice in these years still spoke every day, eloquently, endlessly. This was, in fact, the very age of Rome's greatest orators. But listen closely, and you can hear what it had become. Commentary. The decisions were being made at dinner tables. Caesar took his consulship, rammed through Pompey's land settlement over the Senate's furious obstruction, with soldiers' muscle visible in the forum when needed. The other consul of that year shut himself in his house and issued unheeded omens. and then took his reward. A 5-year, then 10-year command in the north. Gaul. What happened in Gaul across the following 8 years made Caesar the most dangerous man in the Roman world, and this series will render it in the manner we have promised, honestly and at a remove. Gaul, the vast country from the Alps to the ocean, most of modern France and beyond, was not an empire to be captured, but a world of peoples, scores of nations, old cultures, oral learning, iron and gold, warrior aristocracies, their druids and their gods. Peoples the Romans called barbarians, a Greek-made word for those whose speech sounded like babble, a word this series will always hold in tongs and never adopt as its own. Caesar entered that world with a border commission and made of it opportunity by manufactured opportunity, a total conquest. He was a commander, friend, and enemy agreed, of astonishing speed and nerve, and, a rarer gift, the author of his own legend. His dispatches, written in cool, clean, third-person prose, were bestsellers in Rome, and they remain among the earliest first-hand accounts of conquest the world possesses. Which means our fullest source for these wars is the conqueror's own advertisement, a fact to hold on to every time they are quoted as plain record. And the cost must be stated once, plainly, as our rule requires. Ancient writers, hostile ones, but working from the scale of the thing, reckoned that in 8 years of Caesar's campaigns, 1 million people of Gaul were killed, and another million enslaved, out of a population of a few millions. Whole nations were effectively erased in single seasons. One migrating people, men, women, and children together, destroyed at a river crossing in a day. The great final revolt starved out in a siege whose civilians, expelled from the fortress, were left to die between the lines. The precise figures are ancient guesses and surely swollen. The scale they gesture at is not seriously doubted. Rome's markets ran with Gallic slaves for a generation, some of the very hands, let it be said in decision's own spirit, that would build the marble city we will walk in Part 2. Gaul thereafter became in time one of the most deeply Roman lands on earth, its tongue today a daughter of Latin, and none of that unhappens what the conquest was. Both truths, again held together, are Rome. While Caesar conquered, the compact that protected him rotted away in the ordinary tragic manner. The third man of the syndicate got himself killed chasing military glory in the east, and, the heavier blow by far, Caesar's daughter, Pompey's wife, died young after childbirth, and the child did not live. Both men grieved her honestly. The ancient writers linger on it, and the bond between them, which had always truly run through her, was gone. Pompey drifted, was courted, toward the old Senate families, who had despised him for 20 years and now needed his sword. And those families, scenting at last a champion against Caesar, pressed toward the reckoning they had wanted all along. Caesar's command terminated, Caesar recalled as a private citizen. Caesar in a courtroom facing men who had spent a decade preparing his prosecution. Every attempted compromise, and there were many, for most men on both sides could see the cliff, broke against the same few irreconcilables on each side. By that midwinter, the last votes had failed. The tribunes of Caesar's party had fled the city in disguise, claiming the old sacredness of their office had been violated, and Caesar stood at the southern edge of his province with a single legion, facing the small river that marked the line we have known since Sulla was crossed once and the world did not end, which was precisely the terror of it, between a governor under arms and a citizen under law. The river was called the Rubicon. Let us stop beside it, as all of history has, for one night. We may picture it, and we say plainly that we are picturing, for the sources themselves dressed this night in legend almost before it ended. A cold night in deep winter, in the flat country by the Adriatic shore. A small river, the Rubicon, barely more than a stream in that season, running dark between bare poplars, frost on the bridge timbers, the one legion camped in the fields, fires low. The men, Gaul's veterans, 10 years his, sleeping on their arms without needing to be told why. And the proconsul, 50 now, gray in the famous dark hair, lingering. The tradition insists he truly lingered, over dinner, over dispatches, over anything, while the escort waited in the dark. The ancient writers give him hesitations, omens, a portent at the water's edge. They give him, finally, a gambler's words in Greek as the standard goes forward. The die, he is made to say, is thrown. What we can trust is simpler and colder than the legend. A Roman had once again done the arithmetic of the age. On one side, certain political destruction by law. On the other, a throw for everything by war. And the arithmetic, in the republic Sulla had left behind, came out the same way it always would now. Before dawn, the eagle was across the water. By morning, Caesar was in Italy, and the civil war so long dreaded had begun. The war itself this series will carry at our usual distance, in outcomes. Italy fell in weeks, almost bloodlessly, town after town opening its gates while the Senate's grandees, to general astonishment, abandoned Rome itself. Pompey, who understood the sea and the East as Caesar never would, withdrew across the Adriatic to raise the resources of half the world, remarking, the historians preserve the boast, that he had only to stamp his foot in Italy for legions to rise, and learning that the age of such footstamps was over, Caesar secured Spain, then followed him east, and in high summer, in the hill country of northern Greece at a place called Pharsalus, the two most powerful Romans alive spent against each other the military machine 2 centuries of conquest had built. Caesar's outnumbered veterans broke Pompey's army in an afternoon, and Caesar, walking the field after, his own account again, but the gesture rings true against everything else we know of his method, is said to have looked at the Roman dead and observed bitterly that they had wanted it so, that after all his victories, he, Caesar, would have been condemned in their courts, had he not appealed to his army. Self-serving, of course. Also, by everything this series has traced since the Gracchi, not exactly false. Pompey the Great fled to Egypt, where the ministers of the boy king, calculating that a defeated Roman was worth more dead to the winner, had him murdered in a small boat within sight of the shore, before his wife's eyes, 3 days short of his 60th birthday. When Caesar arrived in pursuit and was presented with the head, the sources agree that he turned away and wept. For his son-in-law, for his rival, perhaps for the daughter who had been the bridge between them. Grief and theater are not exclusive, and with Caesar it is rarely possible at this distance to untangle them. He stayed in Egypt long enough to install its young queen, a woman the world would come to know very well, and whom this series will meet properly in another chapter, securely on her throne, and to begin with her a liaison that gave Rome much to talk about. Then he spent 2 more years extinguishing the war's embers across Africa and Spain, wars that grew crueler as they went, in the way of civil wars. And then he came home, unrivaled, the first man since the kings to hold Rome with no one left to check him. And Rome watched, holding its breath, to see what he would do with it. What he did, in the 2 years he was given, was govern and govern by most measures remarkably well. The calendar itself drifted months out of season through generations of priestly neglect, reformed on the best astronomy of the age into the foundation of the calendar much of the world keeps tonight. The month of July still bears his family name, a piece of this story sitting in your kitchen. The citizenship extended generously beyond Italy. Colonies of veterans and the urban poor planted across the sea, Carthage and Corinth themselves, his eye for symbols never rested, refounded as living cities on their old, cursed ground. A public library planned, the law codes ordered digested, the forum relieved by a new forum of his own building. And toward his defeated enemies, he practiced and advertised a policy that genuinely amazed the age. Clemency. No lists this time. No whitened boards. Pardon after pardon. Proud old senatorial names restored to rank and office. Men who had fought him at Pharsalus, set to govern provinces. Rome, remembering Sulla, had braced for the knives, and instead was handed forgiveness, which, a wounded aristocracy discovered, can be the harder thing to take. For a pardon is a gift, and a gift, as every Roman client knew in his bones, marks the giver as the master. For that was the thing his gifts could not disguise. The Republic now had a master, and the forms began to say so out loud. Dictator, Sulla's office, first for stretches, then for years, then, in the last winter, Dictator perpetuo. Dictator without end, the emergency declared permanent, the cage's second bar not bent now but removed. Honors were voted in gusts by a senate he had packed and pardoned, his statue among the old kings, his image on the coinage while he lived, a thing no living Roman had had, a month renamed, honors edging to Roman eyes, toward those of a god, and we know from Part 1's beginning exactly how much weight that carried in Roman belief. And around the honors, the one intolerable word began to circulate. Deliberately floated, his enemies said, to test the water. Rex, king. Twice in that last winter the test was made in public. A diadem found bound on his statue. A crown offered him 3 times by a fellow magistrate at the old festival of the wolf priests before the whole city, and 3 times, to loud applause, refused. Theater, everyone understood, though no 2 Romans agreed on whose theater, or what the applause had really measured. He had announced, for the spring, an immense war in the east. He was to leave Rome in the 3rd week of March. Whatever the constitutional question was becoming, his absence would suspend it for years. If something was to be done about Caesar, it had a deadline. The men who resolved to do it, some 60 senators in the final conspiracy, the sources say, were not a faction from central casting. They were pardoned Pompeians and lifelong Caesarians side by side. Men he had wronged, and more numerously, men he had made. At their moral center, a serious bookish praetor of famously upright reputation descended, Rome never forgot, from the very man who had driven out King Tarquin 5 centuries before, whom Caesar had pardoned after Pharsalus, promoted, and, the sources dwell on it, genuinely loved. They called themselves, in advance, the Liberators. Their reasoning has echoed ever since, and this series will state it fairly, as their contemporaries heard it. The Republic was not a set of conveniences, but the compact of Roman liberty itself. Its whole design, since the first chapter of its life, existed to prevent exactly this. One man above the law, without end. And a Roman who killed a would-be king was not a murderer, but the truest kind of citizen. It was the founding story of the Republic itself. What that reasoning did not include, this too must be said fairly, was any plan whatever for the day after. The liberators appear to have sincerely believed that with the tyrant removed, the Republic, like a spring held down, would simply resume its shape. They had mistaken, as their whole class had for a century, the Republic's forms for its substance. The substance, as we have watched at length, was long past resuming anything. It was set for the 15th day of March, in the Roman reckoning, the Ides, of the year we count as 44 before the birth of Christ, roughly 21 centuries ago, and the last calendar date of Part 1. The Senate was meeting that morning in a hall attached, history's arrangements are sometimes too pointed for fiction, to the great theater complex Pompey had built, beneath a statue of Pompey himself. The ancient accounts wrap the morning in omens. The soothsayer's earlier warning against exactly this day, his wife's dreams, the sacrifices gone wrong, a scrap of warning paper pressed into Caesar's hand unread. And we pass these along as what they are. The stories a shaken world told afterward, when every Roman needed the catastrophe to have been foretold. For in Roman belief, so vast an event could not have come unannounced by the gods. What the accounts agree on beneath the omens is brief, and we will keep it brief, at the documented distance our rules require. He came late, unguarded. He had dismissed, against advice, his escort, saying it was better to die once than to live always fearing it. The petitioners closed around his chair, and there, at the foot of Pompey's statue, the 60 struck with daggers from beneath their togas. The historians record 23 wounds. They record that he defended himself until he saw, among the blades, the young praetor he had favored and trusted. The tradition gives him a last broken phrase of Greek, "You also, child," and then drew his toga over his face and fell. It was over in moments. The Senate fled in panic. The liberators, bloody daggers raised, marched to the Capitol proclaiming liberty restored, and found the Forum below them not cheering but emptying. A city of near 1 million going home, bolting its doors, and waiting. The Republic did not die on the Ides of March. It had been dying for 100 years, since the clubs came out on the Capitol against Tiberius Gracchus. What died under Pompey's statue was the man whose career had proven it, and the liberators discovered within days that they had liberated no one and nothing. There was no republic behind the tyrant. There was only the tyrant's machine, his legions, his veterans settled and unsettled, his treasury, his enraged plebeian clients in their hundreds of thousands, and his name. At the funeral in the Forum, days later, Caesar's consular colleague delivered the eulogy above the body, unveiled the torn and bloodied toga to the crowd, and read out the dead man's will, which left his private fortune in cash gifts to the citizens of Rome, man by man, and his gardens by the Tiber to the public forever. The crowd's grief turned in the hearing of it. The Forum's voice, which we have tracked from its first murmur in a drained marsh, rose that afternoon into something between a lamentation and a riot. The crowd burned Caesar's body there in the open Forum on a pyre of benches and market stalls, where the temple later raised over the spot still shows, to this day, the flowers that visitors leave, and then went hunting the liberators, who fled the city they had claimed to free, most of them before the month was out, and the war for Caesar's inheritance began. And the will held one more clause, the one nobody, least of all its beneficiaries' enemies, had thought to plan for. In its first line, Caesar had adopted as his son and principal heir his sister's grandson, a small, frail, coldly intelligent boy of 18, away at his studies across the Adriatic, of whom Rome knew almost nothing. Against every urging of his family, the boy crossed to Italy, walked into the storm, and announced that he accepted the adoption. The name, he would be called Caesar now, and men could smile at that while they still could, and the debts of vengeance that came with it. Mark Antony, the dead man's great lieutenant, laughed at him. The Senate thought to use him. His mother wept. The boy's name had been Gaius Octavius. History would need, in time, to find him another one. Part 1 of our story ends here, at the pyre in the Forum, and before we rest, let us stand back from it, one breath, in the manner we promised at the beginning. 7 chapters ago there was a river and a ford and huts of thatch on a hillside. The river is still there tonight. It flowed past the pyre, past the padlocked doors, indifferent, the oldest thing in the story. The muddy track by the ford became the queen of roads, and then a net of stone across the world, and carried legions out, and treasure home, and crosses, and now the couriers of civil war. The watched birds of the augurs came down onto silver standards and into the keeping of the poor, who follow them now wherever their generals point. And the voice in the Forum, the Republic's pulse which we promised to keep checking, spoke its greatest ages of law and oratory, and was answered first with clubs, then with lists, and burned, at last, its own master's body in the open square, no longer certain what it was for. Can a system built on this scale, on conquest, on the labor of the enslaved, on the loyalty of armies to men, be governed by anything but a master? The Republic's answer, 60 years in the giving, now lies on the pyre. The next answer belongs to the frail boy crossing the winter sea toward his inheritance, and to the extraordinary, ambiguous thing he will build in the ruins, which the world will call peace, and which is the whole matter of Part 2. Rest now. Rome will keep till you return.